Hi friends, my name is Ankit Shah and today we are going to discuss Philip Sidney's Apology for Poetry. So in the year 1579, a treatise entitled The School of Abuse written by Stephen Gosson appeared. There was a tendency among the Puritans of that age to condemn poets and poetry, and Stephen Gosson was one of them. Philip Sidney wrote a brilliant reply to this treatise, and this is known as Apology for Poetry. Now, we have to know that what are the charges that Stephen Gosson brought against poetry. The first charge is that he classed poets with pipes and jesters and calls them caterpillars of commonwealth, all alike, enemies to virtue. The second charge, a man could employ his time more usefully than in poetry. The third charge, poetry is the nurse of abuse. And the fourth charge is that Plato had rightly banished poets from his ideal commonwealth. Now, Philip Sidney in his Apology for Poetry replied to all these charges. So the first charge is that poetry is useless and so is a waste of time. And there are other more fruitful knowledges a man may better spend his time than in poetry. Sidney replied in this way that no learning is as good as poetry because it provides not only amusement but also instruction. It can teach everybody. It provides some moral lesson, and so nothing can both teach and amuse as poetry does. And poetry was the main source of education. He remembers ancient Greek society that respected poets. The poets are always to be looked up. So the poetry is not the waste of time because it is the branch of learning that can provide amusement and education at the same time. The second charge is that poetry is the mother of lies. Sidney refused this charge by saying that the poet never wants to tell us the truth. Sidney answers that poet doesn't lie because he never affirms that his fiction is true, because poet writes from his own creative power, that was his imagination, and that the question of truth or falsehood would arise only when someone is dealing with fact. The poet doesn't do so. He only probes into the human heart and pours out human feelings, which can never be wrong. So the poetic truths are ideal and universal kind. Because poet uses his imaginative power, therefore poetry can't be a mother of lies. The simple fact is that poet never tells that whatever they are writing is true. It's that because poets are a kind of prophet who use their imagination to write, and they never affirm that whatever they are writing is true. The question of truth and falsehood always deals with history. When someone deals with facts, but poetry is not about facts, poetry is about imagination. Now, the second charge is that poetry has a wanton or corrupting influence. It abuses man's wit, training it to wanton sinfulness and lustful love. Sidney said that in much of the modern poetry, there was a vicious treatment of love. But love itself is not bad. And the fault lies not with the poetry, but with the contemporary abuse of poetry. Sidney rejects that poetry is the source of abuses. To him, it is people who abuse poetry and not the vice versa. Abuses are more nurtured by philosophy and history than by poetry, by describing battles, bloodshed, and violence. As you all know, that history always deals with bloodshed, war, but poetry never do so. Poetry helps to maintain morality and peace by avoiding such violence and bloodshed. Moreover, it brings light to knowledge. He disposes of the third charge, saying that it is man's wit that abuses poetry and not the vice versa. So poetry is not responsible here. Here Sidney wants to say that the fault lies with the contemporary poets of the time who deals with poetry in a bad way, because it is history and philosophy that is responsible for bloodshed, for describing events of war, but poetry is always propagate peace in the society. So the poetry actually is the torch bearer of knowledge. Again, the fourth charge is that Plato had rightly banished poets from his ideal commonwealth. So the fourth charge, Sidney replies to the charge in that way that a great philosopher like Plato proposed to banish the poets from his ideal republic is not acceptable, because Plato sought to banish some bad poet of the time, not the poetry, not the whole poetry. He was not against poetry. He never said that poetry is bad, but he is against the bad poets of the time who is unable to instruct others. He himself was not free from poetically. Plato was also a poet, and that Plato believes that poetry is divinely inspired. Plato never says that all poets should be banished. He called for banishing only those poets who are inferior and unable to instruct the children. Sidney concludes, so as Plato banishing the abuse, not the thing, not banishing it, but giving due honor into it, shall be our patron and not adversary. So, here Philip Sidney simply said that Plato is not against poetry, but he is against the bad poets of the time. And again, in the Apology for Poetry, Sidney defines various sort of poetry, like the pastoral poetry, deals with the lowliest life and thus arouses sympathy and admiration for simple life and hatred for acts of cruelty and tyranny. It is called pastoral poetry. Then there is a elegiac poetry, and it arouses sympathy for the suffering and the miserable. It softens the heart. Satire loves folly out of court. Comedy is an imitation of common errors in a ridiculous fashion and is so effective in warning men against such errors. Now comes tragedy. So tragedy reveals the wickedness of men in high places and brings home to men the uncertainty of life. Lyric hymns the praise of man and God, and thus enkindles virtue and encourage. So these are the different kind of poetry. Now, Philip Sidney also said that poetry is always superior to philosophy and history. In the promotion of virtue, both philosophy and history play their parts. Philosophy deals with its theoretical aspect and teaches virtue of precept. History teaches practical virtue by drawing concrete examples. But poetry can give us both these concepts, because poetry is something which is not only based upon some incidents, but it also have the imaginative creative faculty of the poet. So poetry is not something that merely deals with facts like history. Poetry is diverse, poetry is versatile, and that's why poetry has the power to teach us and move us to a higher level. Now, Philip Sidney, in his Apology for Poetry, points out the prophetic character of poetry. Both the Greek and the Romans honored poets. The Romans called the poets Veds, which means a seer or a prophet, and in the Greek, the word poet means maker or creator. That the poet is a prophet is clearly brought out by the fact that the oracles of Delphos, that means the Delphic oracle, and the prophecies of Sibylla were delivered in verse. They were delivered in the language of poetry. When the poets have been honored in this way, when the holy David himself was a poet, it would be totally wrong to condemn poet and poetry. So poetry is an art of imitation, and its chief function is to teach and delight. Imitation doesn't merely mean copying or a reproduction of facts. It means a representing or transmitting of the real and actual, and sometimes creating entirely new. So Sidney divides poetry into broad divisions like religious poetry, philosophical or informative poetry, and poetry as an imaginative treatment of life and nature. And as we have already discussed, that he also divides poetry into heroic, lyric, tragic, comic, satiric, and iambic and pastoral. So there are, and in his prologue of the Apology for Poetry, he said that Sidney actually justified the fact that that if the art of horsemanship can deserve such praise, because at that time when he wrote this, the art of horsemanship was very popular, and he referred to a name Pierto Piglenio. He was a master of horsemanship.